And in our life, every one of us needs a few things that are absolutely irreplaceable, and one is recognition. And if any of you have looked at the really fine recent studies on bonding or attachment and have observed what people have learned about a baby, and that they simply have to have a mother and others there to look at them, to look into their face. And if they don't, their souls will shrivel. And very likely they will never be whole. They simply have to have that. See, that's recognition. And of course, the next response is recognition back from them. They have to do that. And it begins incredibly early. Some people now say it begins the first day. The recognition of the mother and response to the mother from the baby. See, we don't have a soul in isolation. We have a soul in relation. And of course, that relation is always twofold. For the adult especially, it's to God and to others, people around us. But this point of recognition never ceases to be fundamental, absolutely fundamental. It's so fundamental that it's very tender, and people often cannot stand direct recognition. And the eye is the soul, is the window to the soul, we say, and it is. You have to be very careful with that window, because the recognition has to be one that is not relentless, but is cyclical. It's cyclical. So when we're talking, we look one another in the eye, but we don't stare in one another's eyes unless we're in love or something of that sort. And of course, that's a special condition. Yeah. Well, it actually does approach that, but in fact, you know, that the bonding of people in love through eye contact, where it is of special intensity, is a part of what God has given us to make two people one. And so that's very important. And then reception. Or just plain old word, acceptance. Acceptance of this person that I am looking at. So I don't just recognize you, but I accept you. And that means the expressions of the other. The expressions of the other, the little child, but not just the little child. I mean, it's. I have students who you can look at and see that they have been. Their expressions have not been accepted. They've been graded and they flunked. Often that happens in junior high school. Junior high school is a brutal place. And especially for young men, but for young women as well, because there's all of this grading going on, you see. And of course it begins earlier than that. And I think our culture is especially brutal on small children, because they begin to get graded almost from the time they can walk, and grading behavior. Their little playmates are taught by their lives to do this grading. And so your little girl is apt to come home and say, "Mommy, is there something wrong with my ears?" Because some comment has been made. And so that kind of, see, so it's recognition and then acceptance. Yes? Yeah, well, for example, the way a child plays, or for an adult, the way they speak. No, actually, it might be that, but it wouldn't necessarily be that. Yeah. I mean, in our culture, the look on your face, the face under your look or whatever, is, boy, that's major, isn't it? That's really major. The shape of your body, your likes in food and clothing, your family. Of course, your language and culture. And we are sensitive to these things today in a way we've never been, but I think are more brutal than we've ever been. And so we wind up accepting people in order to be correct rather than accepting them. See? So that's where glass ceilings and all sorts of other things get involved, is that they're accepted. Well, of course we accept you. But not really, see. So, and we all know that. So that's another thing. And then, so we need to add, I'm just going to give you two more things here. There are a million ways of doing this. I think this is really comes to the heart of what we want to address today. Just love. Now, we have to have a context of love, and love means that there is a readiness to support what is good for me. Not necessarily what I want. People love me, sometimes the worst things they could do is what I want them to do. I hope I'm a little better on that now, but I was really a terror in that regard when I was younger. And I thank God I ran into people who would do for me what was good rather than what I wanted. And so love. Now, this is an active engagement. This is not a casual sort of relationship. We're talking here about the intimate context within which a person receives their being. And they have to have love. Not just recognition, not just acceptance. They have to have an active engagement for love. I had relatives like that. They were actively engaged on my behalf. I had aunts and uncles. I suppose my sister was the most important person in that regard. I know there were others that I didn't understand at the time, but she was always there. And she loved me. And she would do what was good for me. And others, of course, also. So that has to be there. And then just one final thing, it has to be secure. Secure. In other words, I know it's going to be there tomorrow. I know it's going to be there the day after. I know it's permanent. I know that it will never change. And when we have these kinds of structures around us, people involved in our lives, then we are in a situation to have a kind of life that is good, that is healthy, that is blessing to others, that shows that there really is a God, that God exists, that all of the good things that we hope for as we learn from Him are indeed true. Now then, unfortunately, this gets broken. gets broken. For all human beings that I know of, it has been broken. And the extent to which there was enough here in early life to stabilize the individual is going to determine how they're going to be able to cope with life as they go along. But they're going to be hurt. And the hurt begins early. It affects these growing points like first love, first job, the first are big ones, where these are often broken, whatever the first may be. And they set the tone of life for many people the rest of their lives, because they don't have the capacity to come back and recover and restore their soul into the kind of wholeness that will enable them to move along well. And those injuries that we receive have to be dealt with rightly, or they will simply curse us as we go through our lives. And if you don't experience those yourself, if you haven't experienced them yourself, you have to recognize that all the people around you, by and large, are just staggering from them. We have something like between 20 million and 30 million clinically depressed people in this country. The figures on alcoholism are staggering. And then you just have the level of negativity, that passive kind of resistance that just drags everyone to death. And so it's just the wounded souls that make up our societies and often our families, and they simply have been broken in these levels, and they've become hopeless and they've become angry. Nearly in all of my experience, when I find a young person who is caught up in rebellion or something of that sort, I find a person who has, first of all, probably done wrong. And then the reaction to that has led them to be angry at the people who judged them. And that has led to a hostile attitude that they justify in terms of the harm that has been done to them. And so the complications just go on and on. And the repairing of the break is what forgiveness is really about. So now, with this kind of general background, let me return to the topic of forgiveness. And with reference to the individual, as there are two directions of love: love to God with all of the heart and the soul and the mind and strength, and love to your neighbor. And neighbor is the person next to you. That's what neighbor means, the person next to you. It's an old Anglo-Saxon term that meant the boor that is nigh thee, the nigh boor. The boor was a farmer, and your neighbor was the farmer next to you. The boor that is nigh thee, your neighbor. Love towards the neighbor. Now, when those are broken, as they are, we come into a world where they are broken and we pick up the brokenness, then restoration has to be made in those two directions, between God and me, and between me and my neighbors. So it's important to understand that when we see something wrong being done, and the soul of an individual being injured by wrong, it's important to understand that all wrong is against God. All wrong is against God. David cries out in Psalm 51, against thee only have I sinned. Do you remember that? Well, it wasn't against God only. I mean, it was other people that were involved in this. But David realized when he came to deal with the issue, he came to understand what he had done, he saw that it was God that he had primarily offended against. Why was that? And we need to spend a little moment talking about the connection here. Uriah the Hittite, whom David caused to be killed, and whose wife he took, was God's person. God was involved in Uriah's life. Now, I don't know Uriah's state of soul. He seemed like a very honorable man and all of that. But regardless, I hurt God. So that's why in theology and religion we use the word sin. Now, that word isn't much liked generally. And I spend a lot of time working in ethics, and people will write 3 pages to avoid that word. Right? They write 3 pages to avoid that word. They don't like that word. And see, what that word does is acknowledge that wrong is basically something happens with God, you see. But God is not indifferent to this. And when I injure another person, when I do not love my neighbor as myself, then I have injured God. And it's important for us to remember that. We have such sanitary ways of dealing with these issues today. My students wear shirts that say practice safe sex. I'm trying to negotiate one which says practice safe sin. But they're kind of puzzled by that. Right? And I have a sense that I'm digging a little deeper than they want to dig. So we just need to keep the whole business of wrongdoing very clearly before us. When we do wrong, we tear a vast web. We don't do a little thing. And one of the reasons why there's such a lack of understanding of right and wrong today is because we have put away that reality. And we say, oh, it's just a little thing. I'll just sweep it under the rug here. It's never a little thing. It's never a little thing. And we try to make it a little thing so we can put God out of the picture. And then we can go ahead and do what we want to do. It's never a little thing because God is involved. And that's important for us to keep in mind, because when we come back to forgiveness, we're also going to say God is always involved there. In many ways, unforgiveness is always ultimately unforgiveness against God. When we don't forgive, we really are saying, God, you let me down. You handed me this situation here and just left me with it. You see. And also, if we forgive, it will only be because God has enabled us to do it. It will be by throwing ourselves upon God that we're enabled to forgive. Yes, you're going to say something.
Question. You're saying practice-based type thing. When we're doing something against God, and you said all wrong is against God, if you're unable to love yourself as you should be able to love yourself, is that an affront to God as well?
Yes, it is. It is, but unfortunately you can't deal with that directly by just saying, now come on, love yourself. Right? What you have to do is to go back and find out why you don't love yourself. And that will be a mixture of things you've done and the things that have been done to you. And, for example, it's very hard to find people who have not been called idiots. Is there anyone in this group that has never been called an idiot? You see, we have people, all of these things are loaded onto us, and we internalize them. You know, the words that come at us just are so brutal. They hurt us so badly. And so we have to have a way of dealing with all of that. We have to be able to find out. And the problem with the self-esteem movement, which our friend Vasconcelos and others have done so much for, is that you cannot pump it up. If you want self-esteem, you have to have God-esteem. You learn to esteem yourself by returning to God's esteem for you. And that is primarily manifested by the fact that He sent His Son to die for you. That He loves you that much. And that means He values you that much. That's another little move that we have to be careful with, because you know, we speak of someone with a face only a mother could love, and we sort of think like God is maybe the cosmic mother who has to love everyone, whether they're worth anything or not. No, God's love for us is based upon our worth, which He knows. It isn't something that He sort of says, now, come on, let's love her, even though she's totally worthless. No, that isn't, no. God sees our worth. God has prepared a time and a place for each one of us, and we are of great value to Him, and that is why He loves us. So it's important to go back to the cause and to try to deal with that. And I hope that some of the things we're going to be dealing with today might be helpful on that. So now God, because He sees the need here, cannot just ignore it. And that's one of the things that when the rupture comes, when the break comes, to take the first point, recognition, if I have not recognized my wife appropriately, or my son or daughter, God knows if I haven't recognized my dog appropriately. I can't just let that go. The dog is built to be more forgiving than anyone else. But that's just because he's not too bright. He doesn't really understand what's happening. Has a good heart, but a weak mind. And that's a blessing to him. But for human beings, you cannot just go on. See, you can't just go on. It isn't like that. You have to deal with what happened. And that's the only way of healing. That's the only way that there can be healing in a relationship. Otherwise, if I just go on, my wife, who is a good-natured and fine, spiritual, mature personality, wonderful woman, she will probably just go on too, but there will always be a lack. And there is no formula that you have to follow, but somehow it has to be worked out. You cannot just hurt people and go on. And God knows that. And you can't just hurt God and go on. Yes?
I think in our present economic system, we've seen a lot of downsizing going on. A lot of people lost their jobs in their middle years over here. There's a lot of job creation there. But there's got to have been a tremendous test of
Mm-hmm.
in these situations. Many of us have known people.
Oh, yes.
Goes on month after month after month, and they get reemployed in something that
No.
meaningful as they had before.
It's brutal.
The reason may not be out there, and at some point in time, there
That's
could
right.
well be a breaking point.
Oh, there is. Yes, that's right. You see, to go back to our initial list about recognition and acceptance and so on, you see, that's when you are, it's, the whole language is so terrible. You got downsized. What in the world does that mean? That sounds like you're standing beside the road and a car splashed water on you or something. You didn't get downsized. I mean, what happened was not the company got smaller. But you see, we choose all of this language to really protect us from the reality of it, and especially to protect the people who are agents in the event. Because they want to be able to say, well, simply, we downsized. And, nothing personal. But of course, it ought to be personal. And it ought to be handled in a way where a person is recognized for what they really are. That's a real tough one. And it's one of those kinds of things that people never recover from sometimes. A question for today in our discussion is, are there resources for that person? Can we say, blessed are the downsized, for theirs is the kingdom of God? And is that meaningful, you see? Well, I believe we can. In my situation, it's blessed are those who didn't get tenure, or something of that sort, you see. Well, is that really there? Blessed, and then you fill in the blank. All of the people who have been bruised and broken by events, not necessarily wrong in themselves. I mean, it's appropriate to downsize in some circumstances, though I think that whole issue needs to be deeply examined. Still, people are hurt. They're bruised. The pattern of recognition, of acceptance and love and security is broken, and the soul is left to flounder. We have people who their mate walks into the room and says, I'm not going to be married to you anymore. And many times no real good reason is given. Sometimes I think it would be much easier if some good reason were given. It's just you have a person who says, I don't want to be married to you anymore. That's very common now. So the question then is there help for that? Well, let me continue on a little bit more here with forgiveness, and perhaps we'll cycle back around to that. God rejoices to forgive because he knows that this is the way to restoration. God loves to forgive. As I commented earlier, I tell some people, God is looking for the least possible reason to forgive. If you give him half a chance, he'll forgive you. And it's true. And we have to have a shift in our thinking about God in order to understand this issue of forgiveness. God loves mercy. What is mercy? God loves mercy. Remember in Micah 6:8, there's a big discussion about what does the Lord require of you. And we get a discussion about rivers of oil and bulls and rams and all of this. The firstborn of my body for the sin of my soul. And the prophet, none of that. Just do justice. Do what's right. Love mercy. Now, that's a striking phrase, isn't it? Not just do mercy, but love it. Actually, sometimes you can't do mercy. In this world, there are real problems with justice and mercy. But if you can't do it, you ought to love it. It's the person who loves it, even when they can't do it. And walk humbly with your God. You see, those three things, just very clear, and right in the middle of it is love, mercy. Love, mercy. Blessed are the merciful. Not in the human way of thinking, but in God's way of thinking. The merciful in the human way of thinking are just people to be taken advantage of. And you rarely find a CEO that is well known for mercy. And that's true in all of our positions of leadership. People may talk about it, but mercy is hard to come by. They're not blessed. They usually don't get into those positions because there's not an understanding of mercy that allows them to operate from a position of mercy and keep the justice in balance and do what needs to be done. But mercy is giving a good that is not deserved. You have mercy, you give a good that is not deserved. You go beyond desert and you give goodness that is not deserved. Graciousness is a term that's associated with mercy. To be gracious is to be giving. Now, in order to do that, you have to have the resources to do it from. And without the resources to be merciful, you simply will not be able to do it, and that will have to come from God. And we'll relate mercy to forgiveness in just a moment. Yes?
But in your definition of mercy, is it a thought process? Or
No, it's an action.
Process?
It's an action.
It's an action.
Mm-hmm. And
You feel merciful, but you take action.
it may be that in our human situation, for example, take the position of a judge in a court. They cannot do all the mercy that they might want to do if they were merciful people. They simply can't. As a parent, in any position of authority, you often cannot do the merciful thing because of everything that's involved. But even in that situation, the idea is you would want to do it. You would do it if you could. And that now is an internal matter. That's a matter of your heart.
So the ethic of that is if I lay somebody off, if I was truly merciful, I find another dress.
Actually, if you are really merciful, there are a lot of things that you will be able to do. One is you will be able to be prayerful and thoughtful and open to God to help you help this person. That's right. And other things, you will not treat them like a pariah after they're laid off, which is one of the things that's hardest to endure. Is how it isn't just that one is laid off, it's that one becomes invisible. So there are a lot of things that can be done, and mercy will find other ways of responding to that need, where there's a merciful heart.